I give the call to the honourable member for Flinders.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Coalition supports action on climate change. Anyone who suspects otherwise needs only to flick back through Hansard to December of last year. Not the 15th of December, when we were brought back at great cost to the Australian taxpayer to consider emergency energy price relief legislation, which, at that time, you could have been forgiven for thinking might actually lower energy bills, but to the 1st of December, when my colleague, the member for Fairfax, rose to deliver his response to the annual climate change statement. In that contribution, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change reflected on the Coalition Government's record, and I quote, "The former Coalition Government's record is remarkable. It acted on climate change and managed the decarbonisation of the Australian economy in a way that was balanced and responsible. In 2021-22, as the Coalition's time in office was concluding, Australia's annual carbon emissions had reduced by 77 million tonnes from when the Coalition was first elected in 2013. That drop of 77 million tonnes meant that under the Coalition, Australia's greenhouse gas emissions fell by over 20% on 2005 levels, an amazing outcome and something that all Australians have every right to feel very proud of. Based on my short time in this place, the key difference I observe in climate change policy between this side and the other side concerns the importance which we place on sustaining and backing Australia's economic growth and, indeed, at the same time addressing cost of living pressures. Our policies have sought to sustain and build the Australian economy and its key industries. The other side's policies have sought to constrain and to punish. As my colleague, the member for Fairfax, noted back in December, reflecting on the Coalition's achievements, while emissions reduced to record levels, Australia's GDP increased at an annual rate of 2.5% before the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. This was one of the highest growth rates among the OECD. We maintained our AAA credit rating and we brought unemployment rates down to their lowest levels in nearly 50 years. I do not doubt the Albanese government's intent in tackling climate change, but it must be said this is poor policy. The safeguard mechanism, implemented by my predecessor as Environment Minister in the former Coalition government, has been working to manage emissions while the economy continued to grow. Labor's proposal is changing the purpose of the scheme from one that stops emissions by encouraging businesses and backing innovation and technology to a scheme that penalises business and imposes taxes. In government, the Coalition mapped out a plan to achieve net zero by 2050 without new taxes. Our plan for the safeguard mechanism was to create incentives and support businesses which made the transition to net zero. But this government is determined to see Australia tax its way to net zero, a plan that history shows will fail and may well take parts of the Australian industrial and manufacturing base with it. Despite the strongest economic headwinds in decades and having already whacked businesses with higher energy prices after failing to deliver their election promise of lowering energy prices by $275, Labor now plans to hit the Australian economy with a carbon tax. By pricing emissions at $75 a tonne, Australia will have a price that is 3 times higher than the one set by the previous Labor government, and then it is set to rise to $100 by 2030. This tax is significantly higher than the carbon price of 8 of our top 10 two-way trading partners, putting our industries at a significant disadvantage. In Labor's rush, they have provided no evidence of the impacts of their policy. In a major reform such as this, people deserve to know the impact, but Labor is refusing to share the detail. What we do know is that many of the industries covered by the safeguard mechanism have strong concerns with many aspects of Labor's policy. Key parts of Australian industry, producers of cement, steel and aluminium, those businesses that are large employers but are in hard-to-abate sectors, have been ignored by Labor. 2 of the businesses targeted by this measure are located in my electorate. They are integral parts of the local economy and have provided generations of meaningful and rewarding employment to Flinders families. BlueScope produces globally competitive exports, the highly sought-after Colorbond, and Esso supplies energy to the Australian eastern seaboard. Esso's gas fractionation plant at Long Island Point directly employs around 80 people and indirectly supports hundreds of other local jobs. On a recent visit there with Leader of the Opposition Peter Dutton, we met fourth-generation apprentices on site, participants in Esso's nationally recognised and awarded apprenticeship scheme. BlueScope Western Port employs around 800 people from the region and over 50 years has provided more than 10,000 local jobs. Both are to be found on Labor's hit list for this new carbon tax. In February, BlueScope CEO and Managing Director Mark Vassella was clear about the potential impact of this measure on future investment in Australian industry. There is no value here in seeing carbon exported, Mr Vassella said. If steel was to be produced offshore and shipped back to Australia because that capability was not here, that is actually a worse outcome for the planet. In this place, debate must be had on how we balance our responsibility to reduce emissions while ensuring Australia remains strong, prosperous, globally competitive and independent. In government, the Coalition achieved this balance. The economy grew up to 23% in our 9 years in office, while we met and exceeded Australia's Kyoto targets. We signed up to achieving net zero by 2050, and we reduced emissions by over 20% on our 2005 base level, putting Australia well on track to beat our Paris Treaty commitments. And at the same time, we lowered energy prices, as the member for Fairfax reminded us all here on the 1st of December. Over the last term of the Coalition government alone, prices dropped for households by 8%, for businesses by 10% and for industry by 12%. Electricity prices dropped to an 8-year low under the Coalition as we reduced pressure on households, lowered costs for businesses and kept Australian industry competitive internationally. One of the ways we kept prices down was by helping facilitate a rapid growth of the supply of gas. It's why we've been offering the government a gratuitous tip since day one in opposition: supply, supply, supply. As we heard yesterday and again today in this chamber, the Albanese government, in collaboration with the Greens, has put future supply at risk. We are one of the richest countries in the world for natural gas, with now no incentive to produce, explore or extract it. The future for energy affordability in this country looks bleak. Last week we learned that Victorian households will cop a 31% increase in the base electricity cost from 1 July. I have honestly lost track of the forecast increases in energy prices modelled over the last 6 months. Was it 56% for electricity and 44% for gas? All the while, the Minister for Climate Change tells us over and over how lucky we are to have him, how much better things are with him in charge of our energy bills. Well, my constituents aren't feeling it, not one bit. After a decade of delicately balancing emissions reduction with economic growth, Labor is now rushing to impose drastic taxes on Australian businesses, for which we will all pay the price.